And cool. All right. So, hi everyone. Firstly, can you see the screen well? This is a new screen setup. Can you read everything that's on the screen? If not, please post on Discord and Ruki will let me know. But all right, okay, sounds good. Slightly wider screen, so I'll try to zoom in at all points. So, welcome to week 12. This is where we start getting into slightly advanced things that will make your life easier when you're opening an open source code base. Until now, we already have enough context, especially if you've seen all the videos until last week, to understand what a project like this looks like if you try to go through their code base. So, dub.sh is a website that lets you do URL shortening, and it's written by someone who works at Vercel, this guy. And Vercel is the company that has created Next.js. So this code base, if you try to go through, it's written in the most popular, most up-to-date stack using Next 13. There are a few things here that we haven't covered, for example, Prisma, which we will, but Next.js, TypeScript, React, the database here is different. We use MongoDB. This has SQL. SQL we'll be doing in a few weeks, but you can go through this code base and understand the front end and the back end. That much context you have now. But this is one of the easy projects. This is a very simple Next app. It isn't a monorepo, does not have too many components. Is written as a side project by this guy. As you get into more professional code bases, things will get slightly harder, and hence we want to cover these things one by one. For example, Prisma, or the thing that we're learning today, OpenAPI spec. That's what's going to happen in the coming weeks. At the same time, I want to be very cautious of the fact that we're marinating everything, practicing a lot. And this comes from a lot of feedback from TAs. So it seems like a few questions that are still being asked are fairly beginner friendly. Things like React what is a prop and how things go down, things like these. So I wanted to do a quick poll initially. Okay, how many of you are feeling comfortable writing a React application in TypeScript? Maybe writing a Next application in TypeScript. Don't worry about monorepos, but other than that, are you comfortable writing a Next.js application today? Yes or no? Bang in the middle. It's like 50% almost say yes and 50% say no. So to the other 50%, I would love to just open chat and feel free to spam what the reason is that you think you're not able to reach there. Is it time commitments? Is it college? Is it I don't understand anything? Is it TAs are not helpful? Is it I don't have enough time to go through the projects? Can you just quickly spam? The chat is open. Mostly time, and some people say overwhelming, exams, time, not clear concepts, time, job, need more time. All right. Yeah, all right. So I agree. This is the same thing I'm struggling with when I'm learning AI. Okay, I don't unfortunately have the time. I have almost all the right guided resources. I don't have the time. And if that is the case, then hopefully we don't need too many extra classes. What we need is a lot of practice. For that, you will have to take out time, and I'm happy to take out like some classes where we just very practically write things because that's the best way to learn. All right. So the high level outcome here is, or like the result of this is, okay, we will be doing another recap of React from the very basics tomorrow. So tomorrow's GraphQL class will either be an offline video or will happen next week. Today's class will do what we're supposed to do, which is the OpenAPI spec. Tomorrow's class will be for beginners to understand Next.js with maybe Tailwind or MUI. But the high level idea is writing a lot of code and not going into the depths of what is server side rendering, what is client side rendering, what is rendering, or what is a reconciler, how React is doing things. We won't worry about that. What we will worry about is how can you get a website and ship it as soon as possible. I think if you practice, you'll learn a lot. That is because we've already done theory many times now. I feel like if time is not the problem, and the problem is it's overwhelming. I think you have to go down the route of practicing a lot and learning versus learning highly theoretically. So that's what we're going to try next for people who are beginners. For advanced people, classes are almost on schedule, and we'll try to stick to that, which means 4 or 5 more weeks of advanced things like these that make your lives easy when you're opening a code base and then contributing to open source projects, like going through the issues, setting them up, so on and so forth. All right, cool. So quick 5-minute check before the official class. I think it's a good time to get right into it. Let's understand the Open API specification, the thing that we're learning today. So a few years ago, until GraphQL, gRPC, if you've heard of it, these things came into the picture. People used to write backends like we have, and people used to hit get calls, post calls, things like these. And basically the app that we've created, these kind of apps were created in the world. What people realized over time was that your apps can be used by multiple things or multiple places. A small example of this is that Zerodha is a trading application. You can use it from your website. You can use it from your mobile app. You can also create trading bots through APIs that they provide and directly hit their APIs without using a client like a mobile device, an iPad device, so on and so forth. You can directly make HTTP calls from a backend server and execute trades. Almost every website that's out there today can or tries to expose these so that your backend is accessible not just by a website, but by mobile apps, by other clients, by backend servers, so on and so forth. This is a very common use case. The problem is when you're creating a backend, it's very hard to document all the endpoints. For example, we had created the to-do application. The to-do application looked something like this. It had, let's say, a post call to /to-do, which had a description that looked something like this. A title, which is a title which is a string, and then a description which is also a string. As your backend application grows bigger and bigger, you have a lot of these endpoints, and everyone has a different shape. Some might be a post call, some might be a get call, some might be a delete call. And the inputs that they expect keep on changing based on whatever you have. If you have a route handler app.get /rec res, if you try to get rec.body.title here, that's what the user needs to send. If you, let's say, randomly think one day, we need to change our schema, let's make title name. Then whoever is hitting your APIs, which is the website, the mobile app, and other people, need to make this change on their side as well, change title to name. So as the backend grows bigger and bigger, more endpoints keep getting added, and throughout the lifetime of your application, you keep changing the inputs, the methods, the routes from your application, from your backend application. So this became a problem when if a backend service like Zerodha changes their API randomly, the endpoints that they've exposed, whoever is trying to hit them will hit the wrong APIs because the backend contract changed. If earlier something was a get request, let's say it became a post request. There needs to be a way to automatically generate documentation and maybe even automatically generate something that websites, mobile apps, or even backend applications that want to directly hit Zerodha's server, there should be a way. If there is a change made in the Zerodha backend system, there should be a way to auto-generate some code that these things use, the websites, the backends, the mobile app, so that this change somehow propagates here. What that is, we will see. But as the backend developer of a company, you should make changes to your backend logic. Something should get generated that reaches the clients, that reaches your official docs page, and everyone in the world realizes that this change has been made, and they make their change in their respective code bases. So this is the problem that things like GraphQL, things like gRPC, and things like OpenAPI solve. They are a more standard way for backends to communicate to, sorry, front ends to communicate to backends. They, at a high level, create some files that have a specification, which means they have a spec, they follow a certain format. And looking at the file, you can figure out, ki, Achha, this is the backend route that does this is the backend route that does that. So that's a high level of why gRPC, OpenAPI, GraphQL were introduced. There are other nuances to each of these technologies as to why they're introduced. But the biggest benefit you can reap out of these is, okay, if you have a website that connects to a backend that you don't own, that connects, oh, oopsie daisy, that's not great. Is there a lag, guys? There is a lag. Sorry about that. I don't think my machine is ready for this much power. So I'm going to switch my machine here. All right. Sorry guys, just 1 second. All right, I'm going to do a quick check. Can you guys still hear me well? Can you see the screen and is there a lag? Are we good? All right, sorry about that. So these specifications came into the picture. So these specifications came into the picture so that backends can talk to front ends, front ends can talk to backends can talk to backends in a very streamlined fashion. What that means we'll get to. I think I'm talking to abstract here. By the end of this video, you should be able to have enough context to create a ChatGPT plugin, 2, create what are called clients, this thing that I was talking about, something that gets auto-generated that websites can use, and they don't have to make changes anytime your backend routes change. Websites simply use a client, and then the client is the place where all the changes happen. And finally, the third thing is, if you might remember my Zerodha video, there was a bug there that I was trying to fix, and that was almost exactly what we're learning today, which was their OpenAPI spec file was incorrect. If their backend routes expected some input, the OpenAPI spec file had different inputs, and so users began to complain, and then they had to fix it. What was the issue back then? How did they fix it back then, which is by hand, and what you can do today to contribute to Zerodha? And this would be an enormous bug to fix, or like contribution to make. It will be very hard to do as well, and there would be less learning. There would be more in Hindi Gada Mazuri, in English manual tasks in that specific Zerodha task. But I'm sure the maintainer, who's the CTO of Zerodha, is going to be super impressed with whoever does this. Will that lead to a job? I don't know, but it's a very impressive thing to do for a very big code base. What that is, we'll discuss at the end of the video. These are the 3 things that you can do by the end of this video through what we're learning today. What is the thing that we're learning? The OpenAPI specification. All right, let's get right into it. To begin with, what's the OpenAPI spec? This is the official definition from their website. It says the OpenAPI specification defines a standard language agnostic interface to HTTP APIs, which allows both humans and computers, this part is important, to discover and understand the capabilities of the service without actually accessing the source code, the documentation, or going through network inspection. What does this line mean? This is a very nice and concise definition of it. Given an HTTP API, given an HTTP backend server, let's say the Zerodha backend server, the OpenAPI specification defines a standard language agnostic interface. So it defines an interface, which means if you look at the file, it's just, oh, there is a get route that to slash to do's. There is a post route to slash to do's slash create, so on and so forth. It just writes them down in a very long JSON or YAML file. And the benefit of this is just looking at that a single file, you can understand what the API does, what each and every route does. And that's useful to you if you are trying to just go through, how do I hit Zerodha's APIs? That is useful to create these clients that I was talking about, automatically generate clients. And a client is basically, let's get to what that is later on, but automatically generate some code that lets you hit their APIs, and also helps this important thing here. Computers understand what this API does. So the reason ChatGPT needs, if you want to get a ChatGPT plugin, you need to expose an OpenAPI file for your backend is because AI does not have access to your code. AI cannot hit random endpoints, inspect network traffic, and understand, this is a GET request, this is a POT request. It needs a very long file which clearly states, hit this endpoint to do this, hit this endpoint to do that. This is the input that is expected. This is the output that you get. So if you want to go to ChatGPT and create a plugin of your own, what is a plugin? If you have the paid version, you can basically add a few plugins here. For example, the eraser plugin that lets you create diagrams inside ChatGPT. In the background, the AI is hitting Eraser's backend. What is Eraser? It's a website like this, ExceliDraw, that lets you draw figures and things like these. So what have they done? The developers of ExceliDraw, this website, or try Eraser more specifically, this website, they had a backend. They created a very long OpenAPI spec file and they gave it to ChatGPT. Okay, this is how you create diagrams using our APIs. And now if I say, hey, can you create a diagram to show addition? What the AI is doing is going to use this plugin, which basically means hit the eraser endpoints, understand what endpoints it needs to hit firstly through that long file, then hit the right endpoints and get the diagram response, understand what the response is again from the OpenAPI spec file, and then finally put the diagram here. So as you can see, this diagram was not created by ChatGPT, it was created by this service. If you have a service of your own, if you have a to-do application, a course selling application, and you want people to interact with it through ChatGPT, you will have to create a file for it. What is the file? The OpenAPI spec file. When properly defined, a consumer can understand and interact with your remote services with a minimal amount of implementation logic. Why is there a minimal amount of implementation logic? Because they just have to send a fetch request and you've clearly defined this is the endpoint they need to hit. More importantly, they can also automatically generate Golang clients, Node.js clients. We'll see what that is, but like a bunch of JavaScript code that does the actual fetch request. The developer just needs to call a function. That's why there's like minimal effort required for end users to talk to your backend servers if your backend exposes a OpenAPI file. An OpenAPI definition can then be used as documentation for also by documentation generation tools to display the API, code generation tools to generate servers and clients in various programming languages, so on and so forth. So since that one long file has all the context of your code, you can create a bunch of things like documentation. What is documentation? Something like docs.binance.com, all the Binance docs, what endpoints you should hit to, let's say, get a trade in, trade out, so on and so forth. Postman has docs, a bunch of websites have docs. You can auto generate them, which means you just need to create the OpenAPI file. And then there are a bunch of people who have written tools to, given the OpenAPI file, generate the documentation page. So these are the benefits of OpenAPI file. Enough about the high level abstract talks. Let's get right into what a file looks like and how you create your own in an Express application like we've created. So I don't think we need to go through this. I've explained this many times now. It's used by AIs. It's used to create clients automatically and exposing your backends to the world. All right. Let's get right into how you create this for an Express application. You can do this for a Java application in Spring Boot, Golang application, so on and so forth. For an Express application, so this is our Express application for the course selling application. If you want to create this file, all you have to do is create one file that looks something like this, either OpenAPI spec.yaml or OpenAPI spec.json, which means You can create it in either one of these formats. YAML, if you remember, is the format that we used in our GitHub CI/CD workflows. So if I go to 100x devs Harkirat, and I think it was week 10. Or week 9, I don't know. Probably week 9. YAML files look something like this. They are very similar to JSON, which means they have a key value pair. For example, the name of this task, let's say, is deploy, and then ignore this one. This one is slightly more complicated. Let's look at a real world YAML file, a real world OpenAPI YAML file. But what do you have to do if you're a backend developer? If you've created a backend system, just add these two files. How do you create them? We will see very soon. What does this file look like? Okay, so let's look at the OpenAPI spec file for a very famous open source project, the one that I tried to contribute to, the Zerodha project. The project is called ListMonk. It has a front end, it has a backend. The backend is written in Golang. So the generation of this file is independent to the language. If there is an HTTP server, you can create a file for this. HTTP servers can be written in Golang, Node.js, any language of your choice. If you look at this file, let's see what it, at a very high level, what it exposes. It says, okay, I am using OpenAPI version 3.0.0. So OpenAPI spec keeps changing and evolving. These keys that you see here, server, info, they keep adding new keys to make it more informant as time goes by. So you have to specify what version of OpenAPI you want to use. 3 is the most latest one that people use. Servers, this represents, you're going to tell this file, as I said, needs to tell everything. What are the routes that you need to hit? Where do you hit these routes? What is the URL for this backend service? That's what they've defined here. And as you'll see, there is always some description associated to a lot of things here. And that's how the ChatGPT model understands what this does. If you just give it routes, it doesn't know, it knows there is a /to-do route. It does not know the /to-do route actually adds something. So the more context you give in this file, the better the AI will understand what your backend does. Also useful if you're not using it as an AI, but just exposing it as a service. When the developers come, let's say there's a developer, this is ListMonk does something completely else, but assume for now, this is the Zerodha backend OpenAPI file, which means it contains all the endpoints for creating a trade, stopping a trade, deleting, removing an order from the order book, so on and so forth. And if I am a developer who wants to do this automatically, create like a trading bot, this is the file that I will look at. I will understand, okay, what's the backend API endpoint that I need to hit? Ignore this part, just metadata, ignore tags as well. Focus on paths. This is, as you can see, it says there is a /health endpoint on the Zerodha backend. It is a get endpoint, not post, not put. Ignore tags as well. This is the description for it. Health check endpoint, basically, that most websites have like a health check endpoint, which tells monitoring service whether or not the service is up. So this is that endpoint. What are the responses you can expect from it? A 200 response in case the server is up. Similarly, there is a /config endpoint, which is also a get. Similarly, there is a /lang/ any language you can send here, English, Hindi, which is also a get, so on and so forth. There are also posts here. There is a put request, post, so on and so forth. As you can see, each one of these has descriptions. A post request to /setting/smtp/test tests the SMTP settings. This is some server jargon you don't have to worry about. The body that the user needs to send is the updated SMTP settings. This is the description for it. And what does the body actually look like? It exists somewhere in the schemas, which is another section in the OpenAPI file. So if I search for this SMTP test through the file, you will see SMTP test is an object and it has these few properties, UID enabled, so on and so forth. For our to-do application, we would have a similar schema. We would say something like to-do type object, properties would be title and description. So schemas is where you put either manually or automatically, where you put all the inputs and outputs of your API endpoints. But paths is where you define ki this is the endpoint that needs to be hit, so on and so forth. All right, the request type, the endpoint, the body that the user should send, the response that the user should expect. All right. That's the high level of how this file looks like. The most important thing is these paths and having right descriptions here. So let's say an AI can understand what each and every endpoint does. And then of course the data, the properties, so the AI knows what input it needs to send when it's calling it automatically. All right. The question now is, how do you generate a file for a backend system like this? So if you look at it, this is a really long file, 4,000 lines plus. It's very hard to do this by hand. If you have an Express application that has 100 backend routes, you can do this by hand. From what I know, it is done by hand in this specific repository. And that is what created the issues that I tackled in the YouTube video of mine. Okay. Since the person was writing this by hand, he missed out this object was incorrect. Let's say he wrote IDs of type string when it was an integer, so on and so forth. So it's never a good idea to write the OpenAPI file by hand. You should always auto-generate it from your code. And that is what we're going to understand today. The end goal that I wanted to talk about was, if you want to contribute to Zerodha, you will have to understand how to do the same thing in Golang. Right now, this file is created manually, which means anytime a new backend route is added to this list monk repository, someone needs to come here and manually add the route, add the input, so on and so forth. If there is a way to auto-generate it, the developer just writes the backend code and then this file gets auto-generated. So there is less manual effort, and since there's less manual effort, there's also less chance for an error when you're trying to update this file. All right. So that's a high level of what the final file looks like. That's all that you need to generate. That's the only thing that's different from how we have built backend systems until now. The problem is, if you want to generate this automatically, you can't write simple Express code. There are no good libraries out there that simply let you plug this into Express. There are a few technical reasons for that. It's very hard for an automated process to read your code and understand, acha, this is the endpoint, this is the input, this is the output. So there are a few libraries that let you do it. We will discuss one such library, and that will change the shape of how we create backend systems. Until now, you might be very comfortable with acha middleware, routes, index.js. Index.js has an app, and you simply do app.listen, app.get, app.post, and you're good to go. The library that we're using today is the best one I could find to auto-generate these docs, which also makes it highly verbose and introduces a few high-level TypeScript concepts that we need to learn. So there is a good possibility / probability you get overwhelmed. I'm going to try to take it slow, and we will learn all the small concepts first in TypeScript before we move on to the main thing. But this is supposed to be a little hard. You can always create this file manually if you want. If you don't want to go down the route of auto-generating it, that's fine. You have the backend routes. You understand how you can create an OpenAPI file. Just look at this copy paste pattern match and you're good to go. That works. But what we're learning today is auto-generating it, which means minimal effort on the developer when he's adding or changing endpoints, and then some process that's automatically generating this file. How do you do this in Node.js? How do you do this in Express? If you want to go one step further, understand how you can do this in Golang. I have actually mentioned that in the issue over here. There's a way to do it, and maybe try to make a contribution here. All right, let's get right into it. Yeah, so you shouldn't be generating this file by hand. You should auto-generate it. Before we get into the library that actually does this, and if you already know these things, this is like classes in TypeScript and decorator in TypeScript, feel free to directly go to this library and try to implement this yourself. But if you don't know what are decorators in TypeScript, if you don't understand classes is fairly straightforward. But let's do these two things first, and then we will proceed to actually creating our backend, which automatically generates an OpenAPI file. All right. So assignment time, let's all open our Visual Studio codes and create a fresh project there. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to create in 100x devs folder a new file called week 12.1. You should do the same and then open it in Visual Studio Code. All right, then create a new folder here, call it classes, and go to the classes folder. Going to wait for 30 seconds, opening the chat if someone still has a high level question at this moment. Is it similar to the /docs Swagger endpoint in Next.js application? It is exactly the same thing. Yes, the /docs Swagger endpoint. In fact, Swagger is the company that sort of renamed itself to OpenAPI. So yes, it is the same thing. Is the docs folder in Turborepo used for OpenAPI spec? I am not sure. I mean, you can use it. I'm not sure what the, or when you create the boilerplate code, I know there's a docs folder that gets created. I don't think it uses OpenAPI. I think that's just random handwritten docs, or even if they're auto-generated, I don't think they're auto-generated via OpenAPI. I could be wrong. Alrighty. Hope you guys have open this. Let's do two things. First thing, npm init-y to initialize an empty package.json file. Second thing, tsc-init to get an empty, not an empty, pre-filled ts config file. All right. npm init-y tsc-init. We've done this many times. Let's create a source folder here. And in the source folder, let's create an index.ts file. I'm going to give you guys 20 seconds to do this. 4 things I've done: npm init, tsc init, package.json, and tsconfig.created. Created a source folder, created an index.ts file. All right. So classes are something we've discussed earlier when we were discussing interfaces in TypeScript. A class in JavaScript looks something like this. I'm going to create a date class. I cannot call it date because date is already used in JavaScript. It's a reserved keyword. So I'm going to call it date class. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to show you a few things as to how you create classes, and specifically in TypeScript, how it's slightly different from JavaScript. All right. Every class should have a constructor. Anytime someone creates a new instance of the date class, let's say const date object equal to new date class, the control reaches here and the constructor gets called. The reason it's called a constructor is anytime a new instance of date class is created, the control should reach here. Very similar to Java, very similar to C++. Second thing, class can have associated methods. For example, a getTime method, which let's say for now just returns 1. And if there is a method that looks like this, I can do date object dot getTime. If I log response, 1 should get logged because date object dot getTime, control reaches here, it returns 1 and this gets logged. Try to marinate just line 1 to line 14 for now. A very basic class. What are classes? Full object oriented jargon. You have classes can create objects, one class can inherit another class, so on and so forth. If you don't want to get into the whole object oriented, why are classes created, which you shouldn't at the moment, very big topic on its own. Just try to understand two things. This is how you create a class. Every class can have associated methods. This is how you instantiate an object for a class. And this is how you call a specific function on that class. You cannot do date class dot getTime. As you can see, it errors out because this is not a static method. Like technically, if I add static here, it will work, but let's not get into that. This is how you create an object, and only the objects that are created for this class, you can call that specific method on. All right. Please copy this over on your machine. Going to give you guys 30 seconds and then we're going to add a few things here. Maybe 20 seconds. Until then, I'll open chat. All right. Is there a lag? First question. Most people know some. Yes. Okay. So that's fine. तो क्विक रिकैप कर देता हूँ मैं. For everyone else, again, if you're finding this very slow, I get it. And I would urge you to just go here to this library, TSOA, go to get started and basically get started. Try to run this locally, which is what we're going to do to the end. For people who think it's fast, going to quickly recap. We have done nothing. Forget OpenAPI. Just focus on how can you create a date class or any class for that matter. This is the syntax to do it. This is the syntax to create an object. This is the syntax to call a method. When you call a method, control reaches here. That's a high level recap of what we're learning today. Just classes. All right. Now classes are extremely useless unless you give them some inputs when you're initializing the class. The way to do that is first you define what keys or what attributes should a class have. For example, if this was an animal class, then it could be whether it's a the animals who give eggs or the animals who lay babies the other way. So you could have a variable type of animal here, and then whenever, which is a string, and whenever someone is trying to construct the animal, they need to send this as input, and in the constructor you have to call this dot type of animal equal to type of animal. We shouldn't type of animal. This is a date class, and I think a relevant input for a date class is the time zone. India, US, what time zone you are in. If you are in the US time zone, get time should give you your time in US time zone. If you're in the Indian time zone, get time should give you the time in the Indian time zone. So a relevant attribute for this class is time zone. That is the input I would expect anyone to send it to me when they're calling new date class. So what have we done? I added a new attribute. This is something that's associated to a class. For example, in the date class, if you're creating a date class that needs to give you time, current seconds, current day, current hour, so on and so forth, time zone is a good thing to take as an input. That's what I did over here. And the way to initialize the class now is send them this input, which in my case, I'm just going to pass in IND for now, and all the errors go away. All I've added this line, and then added this as an input. Let's change get time a little now. As some of you might know, we've done this a few times. Okay, new date. So date is a global variable in TypeScript/JavaScript, and it gives you access to a bunch of date methods. For example, if I do where d equal to new date, if I do d.getTime, it returns me the time in the Unix format, which don't worry about what that is. Maybe a better thing to do here is a method called getMonth. I have defined a getMonth method, which does nothing, instantiates a new date, and then returns the month for that date. All right. We are still not using time zone anywhere. We can, if you need to. For example, let's say this also exposes a function called getCountry that simply returns this dot time zone, or maybe a function called getTimeZone. All right. Let's try to code all of this locally on your machine. Our date class should have 3 methods: a getTime method, a getMonth method, and a getTimeZone method. We need instantiate the class. We get maybe, let's say, the month, and then we log the month here. All right. Going to give you guys 1 minute, opening the chat until then. And for people who find this very easy, maybe try to figure out how you can use the time zone here. So when you're getting the time, you get the time in the specific time zone. For example, I'm in Dubai, I should see 7 whatever. So this is India time 7:40, but since I'm in Dubai, my current time actually is 6:10. So that's what I should see if Dubai is sent as the input here. All right. Advanced people figure that out. Folks that feel this is overwhelming, chat is open, ask any questions, but hopefully this is not too difficult. 30 seconds if there are any questions. Seems like explain the constructor part. Can we do this in Next.js? You can do this everywhere. Classes are a JavaScript TypeScript concept, not a Next.js, React, wherever. It can work everywhere. Classes are a JavaScript concept generally. So you can run them here, you can run them in React, you can run them in Node.js, you can run them everywhere. Constructor part is basically whenever you call new on a class, the constructor gets called, and here is where you construct the object. For example, this date object, if I try to do a date object dot time zone and let's say I make this public, I am sort of, this specific date object has been created for India. You have to construct the object. That's why it's called the constructor, because it takes inputs k, what is this specific object's time zone? If this was an animal class, what is this specific object's type? Is it a mammal? Is it a दूसरे वाला animal? So constructor's purpose is कि you attach a bunch of properties to this object by giving them as inputs here, and then in that object has access to those properties throughout. You can also access them here. So this dot time zone can be accessed here, and that is what you can pass to this date function to get time in some specific time zone. All right, we are not going to do that. Just wanted to show at a high level what a class looks like. All right, very basic, very simple class that does a few things. Let's quickly try to compile it and run it. The way to compile it is tsc, maybe go back a folder, tsc-b, that should create an index.js file, then run node index.js, source/index.js, and 7 is logged. 7 is the month that we are in. That is what should get logged right here, because we did date object.get month, which would make the control reach here, which would get the native date object in D, and d.get month returns the method. You might say, Harkiyat, we have just created a wrapper on the date native date class, and I would say I agree, that is true. We have just created a basic wrapper. If you want to, feel free to use the time zone and then create a new function called get time in that specific time zone, which returns time converted to that specific time zone. I'm not going to do that in this video, but this is a high level of what a class looks like. Important things to note: have associated methods, and they have associated properties, and sometimes these properties are created during the construction of the object. That's a high level of how you create a class. The next thing we need to learn is something called decorators, which is a more language agnostic concept. Is present in Python, is present in Java, and helps you do a bunch of things. Before we proceed, I'm going to quickly recap what have we done until now. We want to create an OpenAPI file for a Node.js backend, which means we want to create a Node.js backend. We want to create an OpenAPI file for it. To do that, we need to understand two things: classes and decorators. We have understood classes until now. This is a basic way to create a class. Second thing we're understanding is how to create decorators. Before that, what are decorators? So decorators are, if you've in Java heard of annotations, which is basically to a class if I want to add some functionality, or to a method if I want to add some functionality. For example, let's say I want to log how much time it took for a specific function to get called here. I just want to see कि ये जो function है, or any function in this class, how long does it take for it to run an operation? Let's say there is a new method here called expensive operation, and here I do a for loop from I equal to 1 to some very long number. I define a counter variable here, and I do counter plus plus, and I return counter. So I've created a very basic function called expensive operation to simulate an expensive operation. What is the expensive operation? Iterating from 0 to some 10 million and increasing the number in a counter. This function should take a fairly long time, especially this part. Let's say it doesn't return counter, it just logs counter. Now what I want to see is how much time did this guy take? How will I do that? Can you guys think of it? Maybe take a minute to try to think how you can find how many seconds or milliseconds more specifically it took for the control to go from here to here. Okay, take 1 minute to try to figure it out yourself. If not, I will code it on the screen here. Let me open chat if anyone has any questions. It seems like you don't have a TSO. Yeah, run TSC in one folder above, Karthik. You're running it in the classes, the source folder. You should run it in the, no, sorry. Let's see, classes/tsconfig.js. Oh, you don't have a tsconfig.json, it seems. So maybe run tsc --init in the classes folder and you should be good. You should see a tsconfig here, only then will it work. Date.now, that is correct. Log time before and after calling the call, that is correct. Yeah, I think straightforward. So let's get right into it. Let's start to code it. You can do something like const start time equal to new date dot get time. Now this is the native date object. It has nothing to do with this date class that we have created. We are simply using the date global JavaScript date object to get the current time. You will get the current time in the Unix timestamp here, which is basically the number of seconds that have passed, or more specifically milliseconds that have passed since some date in 1970. That's just the standard of the Unix timestamp. Current Unix timestamp is some very long number. It basically represents the number of seconds that have passed. So this is the number of seconds that have passed since Jan 1, 1970. That's just a standard. Unix timestamp means that. In JavaScript, if you do new date.getTime, you get the current Unix timestamp. If I do this here as start time, if I at the end I do this as end time, then I log total time taken is end time minus start time. That should give me the total milliseconds that it took for this expensive operation to run. हाँ कि ना, ये तो simple है. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. Expensive operation. This is the expensive operation. I added a start time above it. I added a end time below it, and I logged what is the difference between end time and start time. If I try to run this, which is tsc to compile, node source/index.js to run, I just see 7. That is because I have not called the expensive operation here. Let me call this. And it says total time taken is 656 milliseconds. If I add another 0 here and I recompile by typing tsc and I run node source index.js, now it will take like 5 seconds or something like that, because there are too many zeros here. This is very expensive as an operation right now. Total time taken is 9 seconds almost. So I had to add 1 to 3 lines of code for this to work. Now let's say I want every function of mine to spit out how much time it took. That would mean I would need to add start time here and then end time at the end. This gets slightly tricky because we're doing the return here. So that's why I did not want to return anything here. Let's say they just log it rather than returning it. In that case, I have to add 3 lines. Start time here, end time here, and then log. So this is a very manual thing, and this is a very important use case for a lot of people. A lot of people want to track how much time a method took. So for this, we introduce something called decorators. Let me remove this logic here. If you don't understand it, it's fine. You can code it later on. It basically gets the current time, does the expensive operation, gets the current time again, and then subtracts the two to get the total duration of this operation. All right. But I'm going to remove this and remove this. And I want to delegate this to someone else. That's where decorators come into the picture. So let's see what a decorator is and how you use it in our application. There is a very famous repo, not famous. This is the first repo I found. So decorators are not very famous in TypeScript. They have recently been introduced. There aren't a lot of open source decorators out there already. I would urge you guys to simply look at this repository. You don't have to look at it, just posting it here. It's called Helpful Decorators, which has a bunch of helpful decorators in TypeScript. For example, let's look at the important one here, which is measure. So measure is a decorator they expose. What is a decorator? Under the hood, it's just a function. But if you use it like this, which means if you have a class and you add @measure over here, wherever the code of this decorator is written, it will understand, acha, this is a method. It will do the thing it has to do, which in the case of measure is measure how much time it takes. And then it will finally output that to the screen. So all I have to do is add @measure here, add @measure here, and I will see how much time it takes for a specific function to run. That is what decorators are. Let's see a bunch of other decorators they have introduced. There is one called once. If I add once above a method of mine, what will it do? It will make sure this method is called only once. If someone calls test.method 5 times, creates an object and then tries to call it 5 times, it will only run once. That's what this decorator does. How do you write a decorator of your own? This repository has the code of each and every one of these decorators if you want to understand. For example, if you go to measure.ts, this file, this function in the end is what does this whole thing. How it does it is out of the scope for us to understand, at least at the moment, maybe forever. You don't have to know this. Good to know. Good to create decorators of your own, but not right now. So right now you don't have to worry about this. Just need to understand at the high level how you use them. All right. So let's try to use a few of these in our code base that we have written until now. Helpful decorators is the library that we are using. So first we have to install this locally. The way to do that, go to VS Code, go to the terminal and do a npm install or yarn install helpful dash decorators. Once you've done that, try to use a few decorators in your class that we've created. For example, let's add a log here to hi from get time. Let's add a log to get time and let's try to run it only once. So import once from helpful decorators and add at once here. It will give you a type error. Feel free to ignore for now. It will still work. Try to run tsc-b. Oh, it's an actual error. Oh, yes. One more thing you have to do is, so I've just done two things. Imported once from helpful decorators, added at once here. Third thing you need to do is make sure you use experimental decorators as a flag when you're calling TSC. TSC won't run. This is an experimental feature, does not exist by default in TypeScript. Unless you run tsc-b -- experimental decorators, something I'm posting in chat, it will give you an error. So after you have added once here, after you've used this decorator here, make sure you're running tsc-b -- experimental decorators, and only then will it compile, else it will not compile. All right. Maybe remove -b as well. There you go. tsc space -- experimental decorators. Now try to run. Oh, one more thing you should do is call get time like 5 times at the bottom. So let's go to the, let me make this slightly cleaner and slightly smaller. Remove all the functions that we have here. Just have a get time function, very simple, and call that function 5 times at the bottom. Don't need to store it anywhere either. So this is what your code should look like. You have a date class, has time zone as an attribute. You have the once decorator on get time, and you're calling date object.getTime 3 times. All right. Feel free to take 15 seconds to reach this code that I have on the screen locally. Let me also, create a gist for it. So in case you have some error, you can just follow along with the gist. All right. Hopefully a few of you have tried to run this locally, which is tsc space -- experimental decorators, and then node source / index.js. You see hi from get time only gets called once because this decorator does some magic, transforms the get time function, adds some logic here that might look something like this: if called more than once, then return, and then somehow increases a variable here. Try to think how you can do this yourself. But all I had to do was add one line of code here, and that added this functionality to my function. Let's see measure. This is the function that will measure how long a specific function takes. As you can see now 3 times the call is happening because I don't have at once here, but first time it says it took 2.68 milliseconds, second time it took this much, third time it took this much. So it's going down because JavaScript memory works that way. If the same function gets called twice, second time it's slightly faster. And as you can see, all I had to do was 1 line of code versus me adding 3 lines of code. Under the hood, add measure is doing the same thing. If you look at the code of the decorator on GitHub, you will see it does the same thing. But you don't have to write 3 lines of code. You just add measure to your function, you're good to go. All right. That is a high level of decorators. We've learned 2 things until now. What are decorators? What are classes? Classes we already knew. Decorators, don't need to get into the depths of it. High level, I need to understand a decorator writes some logic that is written by the developers of that decorator. You simply use it in your repository by calling at that specific decorator. It does what it says it does. Why do we need it? Because when we are creating our Express application, we have the way we'll write our Express application will look something like this. Okay, get method to slash whatever to do's should whatever do rec dot const body equal to rec dot body dot title, and then whatever do the DB call here. What we will have to do is simply add like some OpenAPI file kind of a decorator, and that will automatically generate our OpenAPI file. That will automatically understand that this is a get call to slash to do's, and then figure out how to automatically generate the thing versus us having to write it manually. That's why we have to understand this concept of decorators. You can just use it as a black box. You don't have to understand how they work under the hood. It is great to know if you know how they work under the hood, but as you can see, it is still an experimental feature. So it's not something that's used very often, but it is what makes TypeScript very powerful and slowly converts to languages like Rust and Golang, because these are very common in almost every other language. Java has annotations, which is the same thing. Python has decorators. So it's like only a matter of time before TypeScript needs them as well. All right. We're at 7:58. Let's take a 7-minute break, and I'm going to open the chat for everyone. All we've understood is just what is OpenAPI, what are classes, what are decorators. If you have more questions now, feel free to post them. All right. Pause. What is a client? Good question. A client is basically, let me just show you the thing that I had open. So don't worry about what appears on my screen right now. This is the practice that I was doing before. A client is basically when you have the OpenAPI file, right? After we have done with today's class, we will have an OpenAPI file that looks something like this. Not in the YAML format, in the JSON format, both work, both are the same. Here, as you can see, we'll have a bunch of paths, for example, slash to do's ID, so on and so forth. This is our OpenAPI file. With just this OpenAPI file and a single command, you can create something called, for example, I've created the node client, which means the TypeScript client, which exposes a few things. For example, it exports something called default service. And if you look at app.ts, I can simply call default service.getToDo, which under the hood will do the fetch request, so on and so forth. This is what's called a client. A client is basically a library which under the hood does a bunch of fetch requests, has all the logic to send the right things. You as the end developer simply need to call functions on it. And for example, I was fiddling with this. So this expects to do ID and let's say authorization header as an input. So all you had to do as the application developer was this default service, which comes from the client that we've auto-generated. Call this.getToDo. The client has the logic to hit the right endpoints. If you change your backend in the future, all you have to do is rebuild the client, this node client, and your end user application still looks something like this. That's what a client is. We will come to that again later on, so don't worry about too much about that right now. What is OpenAPI? OpenAI part works in Next.js. You have only told for Express. How OpenAI part works for Next.js? Oh, it doesn't. OpenAI. So, okay. Take a step back. OpenAPI is only for backend servers, HTTP servers. OpenAI, ChatGPT can only talk to backend servers, cannot talk to front-end servers, which means cannot understand Next.js, cannot understand the other thing, React. So Alan, आपके लिए the solution is just run tsc space -- experimental decorators. Don't add -- build here or -b here. All right. Can we implement OpenAPI spec in Next.js backend? You can do it in Next.js backend as well. Oh, but I'm not sure if there is a library that exists for it. The library that I'm teaching today only works with Express. Most probably that will not work for Next.js. There's another library called Swagger JS doc that sort of works, that does not use decorators, that uses comments. So this might work with Next.js. I am not sure. Um, yeah, so good question. I don't know what you will do in Next.js. If either of these doesn't work, you can either write a library of your own, or you will have to create the thing by hand. Or maybe there's a library out there that I don't know of. Can we write decorators above the class? Yes, you can. Decorators can be for methods, decorators can be for classes. So there is no end to uh, where you attach a decorator. I think they can also be for arguments of a function, which means something like at, measure, whatever, to do ID, something like that. So you can have them here, you can have them here, you can also have them here. Yeah. This one will attach to the class, this one will attach to the function, this one will attach to the argument. All right. Going to be back in 3 minutes, guys. Small break. I'll see you guys in 3 minutes. All right. 8:05. Hi everyone. Oh, yeah. So let's do some coding. Then we'll do some questions, and then random talk at the very end. But let's get with the coding part. Let's finish it really quickly. We have created backend systems many times now. We are going to create a backend server using some slightly different syntax today. But overall idea is the same. You have routes, you have inputs, you have outputs, and the only extra thing that we'll see today is how an OpenAPI file gets generated automatically. All right, get your coding hats on. Create a new folder right next to classes. Let's call it to-do backend. All right, go to to-do backend and then do the standard things. npm init-y tsc-init. Make sure you're in the to-do backend folder. By the end of it, make sure you have a package.json and a tsconfig.json in to-do backend. All right. Let's see. These are the high level steps that we need to go through. We will go through them on the official documentation page of TSOA. So this is the library that we are using. It's called TSOA. I think it stands for TypeScript Open API, and they have a very nice getting starting guide. So I would urge you to open this locally on your machine as well. The getting started guide of TSOA. We are going to just follow the steps that they have suggested and change the application for ourselves, the to-do application rather than the user application that they make us build. All right. I'm going to maybe open these side by side. I think that works. All right. So on the getting starting page, they say create an empty repo. We've called it to do backend. Ignore the git init. Make sure you're in the right folder. We called npm init-y. They call yarn init-y. Both are the same. Then they ask you to install a bunch of dependencies, which includes TSOA and Express. So make sure you install this. Then they ask you to install a bunch of other libraries. This may break for some people. If this does not work for you, the next, delete the folder, create a new folder, and over there only install @types/express. This part may break for some people. I am going to copy it as it is so that everyone does the same thing. But if it does break for you, delete the folder, do all these steps again, and only install @types/express. Don't install the whole thing. All right. You can use yarn add-d. You can also do npm install --dev and paste. What is --dev? You don't have to worry too much about it. It basically means it's a dev dependency. And if you look at package.json, it resides somewhere in, oh, maybe it's not --dev, maybe it's -d or something like that. That basically means they reside here in dev dependencies and not dependencies. I gave the wrong command. It's probably -d or something like that. Don't worry about it. Even if it's here, it's fine for now. All right. We have already run tsc-init. Until now, you should see a package.json. Maybe you see a yarn.log. Maybe you see a package.json.log.json. Both are fine. Ignore them. tsconfig you should see, and package.json you should see. Node modules also you should see. All right. Now they ask you to create a TSOA config file. So this is something new. This is where you configure how you want TSOA to work. Where should it find your routes from which it automatically generates the OpenAPI spec? Where should it output the spec? What spec version of OpenAPI should it use? Should it be 3? Should it be 2? So on and so forth. So copy over the whole thing. Make sure you don't copy this comment and create a new file called tsoa.json. Paste the code here. All right. Going to wait for 10 seconds. Maybe go through this file, try to understand what it says. This is the source of your top level file, basically. Similar to the express server.js file or TS file, where you control your where we will finally store our what are called controllers, which is where you sort of define routes, things like these. The directory in which it should output the spec, the version of the spec, and this also where you should output a bunch of files other than the spec, which are like, you'll see what those files are. All right. Cool. Defining our first model. All right. So backends are usually, there's this very famous framework called MVC, Model View Controller. Model basically means the shape of your data, or storing data in your backend, database. View means what appears to the end user, which means usually the UI, and controller means the thing that joins both of them. It's a very high level thing. Everyone has nuances as to what it means. Don't worry about the technical term being used. What is an MVC framework, or what is models, views, and controllers? This framework expects you to, or they don't really expect you to put files in this specific structure, but we are going to follow it, which means whenever you want to create a route, which in our case is going to be a bunch of to-do routes. In their case, they're suggesting a bunch of user routes. We are going to create our own use case, a to-do application. So in that case, we are going to first create a top level source folder. So let's do that. Then create, in our case, a folder called to-dos. In their case, what they suggest is users, but we are going to create to-dos. So source/to-dos, and inside that create a file called todo.js or todo.ts more specifically. All right. Source to-dos todo.ts. Going to wait for 10 seconds. All right. Then they ask you to export what the to-do looks like. What does our to-do look like? Just the interface for it, which means the type for it, not the actual thing. In our case, the to-do interface looks something like this. There was a title, there was a description, there was an ID, and there was the done variable, which means whether or not the user has done this specific to-do. We are not adding authentication right now. We are not creating a website where multiple users can come and create to-dos. If that was the case, you would have to add a user ID here as well. We are not doing that to keep things simple for now for V1. So this is what a basic to-do looks like. This is how it would reside in your database, in your MongoDB database. Let's say it would have an ID, title, description, and whether or not it is done. All right. That's what is called the model of your thing that's being stored in the database. Second thing it says is the service. Let's create a service, which is a class. This again doesn't have to be a class, could be raw functions, could be whatever you want. This is similar to your route handlers. Until now we had done app.get. So yeah, not exactly similar to this, but whenever we did an app, never mind. This is just a bunch of functions that, if you see, are basically an abstraction to your database call. Yeah, these are functions that reside in service that are abstraction to your database call, which means other people can call this file, give it inputs. For example, get me the user with this ID, and it will find that user from the database. For now, they have just hard coded it. We are going to hard code it as well. But services generally is a file where you create functions that sit on top of the database, so that whoever is calling this doesn't need to write SQL queries or doesn't need to worry about mongoose. They can simply call user service.get, and that will give them the user's details for a user with this ID and this name. And if you want to put something in the database, let's say, again, a backend system will call this, another backend file will call this file. They can simply call user service, create a new instance for this, and then simply call .create on it. That will do the database call. We are not doing any of that. We're mocking all of that at the moment. But service files are usually where you put all of this logic to connect to the database, and other people call your file when they want to put something in the database, get something from the database, so on and so forth. So the next file you have to create here is to-do service.ts. Here, one TypeScript concept comes here, very nice concept. It says export type to-do creation params equal to pick from to-do the title and the description. All right. I have added some code here that might feel overwhelming to a few. Missing something. This line is the same as this line. They both do the same thing. The first one says, okay, from the to-do interface that already exists, I need some specific properties. So let me just get title and description from it. Why is first approach better? Because if in the future title changes from description to from string to number, let's say, you just have to make that change one place. If you use this, if you don't use pick and define them separately, which you can, you will have to make the number change in two places. If title becomes a number, theoretically, of course, it would never be a number, but you get the idea. So that's what pick in TypeScript does. It lets you pick certain keys from another interface. You can use this. You can also use this for now. Either are fine. I'm going to use the elegant one. What is this type? This is similar to a Zod type of what user should send when they're trying to create a to-do. This is similar to Z. If we import Z from Zod and do a Z.object title, Z.string, so on and so forth. So when you're using Zod, this is how you can create types for the input that you expect from the user. In our case, right now, we're not using Zod. So simply export type to do creation params equal to this. All right, straightforward. Finally, create the service class. Again, you could totally just be like export function get. You don't need these to be services. You don't need this to be a class. It can simply be methods. But this is the structure they're following. That's what we're going to follow as well. All right. Export class. Feel free to just copy and replace. I'm going to do it by hand. Service. A get function, let's say a to-do ID, it takes as input, which is, what is a to-do ID? It is a string. And again, it returns a to-do. So the person who hasn't done TypeScript before, this might feel a little weird, but don't worry too much about it. It's just some extra things that we've added to the method. All right, what should it return? Let's just return a mocked to-do for now. Maybe with the same to-do ID that the user sent. Title, mocked to-do, description. To-do, and sorry, you don't need this. And finally, there's title, there's description, there's ID, there's done, false. All right. We have not yet created an HTTP server. We have not even created MongoDB calls. Ideally, you should do like a Mongo call here. For example, whatever user.get and try to get this to-do ID. We're mocking things for now because we're not worried about the application logic. We're simply worried about how you can create an OpenAPI file. All right. A get function and a create function are the two things you need. What are the inputs to a create function? It is the to-do creation params. So I can simply be like to-do creation params of type to-do creation params. Maybe it returns a to-do as well. And what does this guy return? Yeah, it returns a to-do. And again, ideally you would want to do a database post here, post into your database that a new to-do has been created. We're just mocking this, whatever, add a log here, mock db call. You don't have to, feel free to. And then I simply return a random to-do for now. This service doesn't yet hit the database. Ideally it should. We have now finished the service which exposes two functions. Ideally exposes a class which exposes two functions. A get function which given a to-do ID should ideally hit the database, isn't right now, and returns the details for the to-do. Create, which actually creates the entry in the database. All right. We've not yet introduced Express anywhere. We've not introduced any HTTP server. Very simple class that we've created, which is called the service. Finally, the most important thing is the controller. This is what you need to know. This is where most of the magic happens, where you use these decorators. So let's create a to-do's service, TODOS service.ts, and let's just copy this and let's start from the top. It firstly imports a bunch of things from TSOA. We will see what these are. Most of these are decorators. It imports user from user. We will import to-do from /to-do. And lastly, it imports user service and user creation params. We are going to import to-do creation params and to-do service. Again, this is the service, the class that has the get and the create functions that we defined here. The get function and the create functions. We need to use them because this file that we're creating, the service, is what has all the logic to basically the express logic. Think of it at a very high level. This is the file that will contain the app.gets, app.posts. Not exactly, but very close. All right. Last thing that they've done is they've created a user controller. We will create a to-do controller which extends controller. Where does controller come from? It comes from the TSOA library. So they have already a class called the controller class. It has a bunch of magic that you don't have to worry about. And we extend all of its functionalities. This basically has the logic to actually create the routes, go through your the methods that you're creating here and actually create final routes. If you want to, feel free to look at the library and understand how it does under the hood. We are not going there yet. Now it comes the most important bit, adding decorators. The first decorator is add route decorator. This basically means what is the route for this specific service or this specific controller. In our case, it is to do. If I add to do here, the user needs to go to slash. If the user goes to slash to do, control reaches here, like theoretically. This is the thing that controls everything that comes on slash to do. We're effectively creating an HTTP server now, similar to Express. Rather than doing app.get slash to do, we're doing something like this. On the route to do, if the user sends a get request, which means add get to do ID, then this would be the handler. And here we simply do return let to do service equal to new to do service, return to do service dot get to do ID. This comes from here. I'm writing a few things. We'll explain what each one of these means very soon. All right. So I've done a few things. Let me try to explain what I've done. I have created a to-do controller class similar to our date class. I've added a get to do function here similar to the function that we had. The get to do function takes one argument, to do ID, but throughout I've added a decorator here. I've also added a decorator here. What does this guy do? Eventually, this is what gets converted into an Express server. You will eventually see how whatever you're writing here will get converted to app.get slash to do ID. And the way for TSOA to understand what are the routes is you add the right set of decorators here. The route decorator tells this is the high level route for whenever there is a call to slash to do, control should reach this controller. And this guy says, okay, whenever there is a get call to slash to do slash any to do ID dynamic, control should reach here. And this also has a path parameter to do ID, which is basically this thing. So to do ID is a path parameter, which means slash to do slash whatever is here 1, 2, 3. This is the path parameter. It's different from query parameters, different from body. And we get that the value of that here in the to do ID. Finally, we do the database call to get, or like we use the service which it's supposed to do the database call. It's not doing right now. You can pull all the logic from the service here as well. It will still work. I think most probably 99%. If not, ideally it's a good idea to have the service separately. This guy simply uses the to do service, generates a new object for that class, and then simply does a get. What was the get? The get that we had defined here in the to do service class. All right. We will do a big recap, and maybe this is the only endpoint we will expose for now. Let's not worry about this other post endpoint. Let's just focus on a single get endpoint for our application, which means by the end, an Express server should be running that should be listening to app.get slash to do ID, and it should be doing some logic somehow and getting the thing from the database to you, or more specifically from memory to you, because that's how we're getting this thing. All right. Deep breaths here. We have done 3 things after we initialize the repository. Created the model for our to do, defined the type of it, the title, description, ID, and done. These are the 4 things that a to do needs. Defined a service which eventually should connect to the database, right now returns mock data and returns two functions. These are not yet exposed to the internet. This file does not do any of that. This is a very simple wrapper over MongoDB eventually. Right now it's just returns things as such. To do service is where the magic happens. This is where most of the important thing is present. This is what is similar to your the file where you write app.get app.post until now. And what does it do? It defines a class called to-do controller, which extends controller from TSOA. It says on the /to-do route. Now how it does it, how decorators work under the hood is a whole different story. But all you have to do as the application developer is write ke bhai /to-do pay, and whenever there's a request, and /to-do/ any to-do ID, dynamic to-do ID, control should reach here, which should hit the service, what does hit the service mean? Basically call a function on the service, not an HTTP call, simple function call, and get back the to-do and return it to the end user. This much is enough to create an HTTP server. You might ask, Sarkis, we have not written app.get anywhere. Yeah, that's what we will see, how this gets transformed into that. But as the application developer, this is all that you have to write. Sarkis, why do we have to specify @path here? Because your OpenAPI file needs to contain what are the inputs, what are the outputs. That is why you need to clearly define the types of what you're taking as input, and in fact, even what you're sending as output. So you need to add returns promise of to do here, so that your OpenAPI generator, whoever is converting this to an output, understands that this specific route returns a to do which looks something like this. All right, let's save this. Let's do a quick poll and then we will proceed. How are we doing? Is this clear? Can you do this yourself slowly? Understand at a high level? Do we know what's happening? Alrighty. 65%, which means we will take a pause. Let's answer a few questions. Recap, just everyone wants a gist. So let me just push this to GitHub. That is a good thing for me to do. Let's see, to do app week 12, public create All right, the code has been posted here. Feel free to look at it. Can you please turn on the text wrap? Oh, so that this goes to the next line. How do you turn it on, Manas? Good point. I should turn that on. I'm opening the chat only for Manas. Do you know how to do that? Or does anyone know how to do that? How to turn on text wrap? So this goes to the next line. Alt Z. Oh, okay. Mac doesn't have an alt. Command Z. Nope. Anyone know how to do it on the Mac? Someone said, is this experimental? Is this being used in open source projects? This is not being used directly in open source projects. All open source projects sort of want to create an open API file. For example, ListMonk wants to create, is already creating it, but they're creating it by hand. So the reason to learn this is one, you can create ChatGPT plugins which are not related to open source at all. Two, as companies create these files, you can help them migrate to the OpenAPI spec and using these tools, because they're very hard, very niche tools to do this. Alrighty. Code. Can you please text wrap? मैं करता हूँ यार एक second. What is @path? It basically tells the OpenAPI file generator that this is a path parameter, and this is an input that we expect from the user. If you don't give at path, it will not know that the input that's coming here is something that needs to be put in the OpenAPI file. So all these annotations we are writing because we want to generate the OpenAPI file and not automatically, and every annotation that you see here will eventually reflect in that OpenAPI file when your routes are created there. Is the get and create method inbuilt? No, these come from here, TSOA. So these decorators, similar to how we had the once decorator from that specific library that we were using before this, these also come from there. All right. Text wrap. Does anyone know the solution of that on Mac? From where do you find these libraries? I googled what is the best way to do. Option Z doesn't work for me. To do OpenAPI file automatic generation in Node.js. So this is very easy to do in Rust, slightly harder to do in Golang. No easy way to do it in Node.js. So I googled through and understood that this is the best library to do it. There are easier libraries in which you don't have to understand decorators, but that's not something that impresses an open source maintainer. This would impress someone. With minimal effort, you have your routes, your application logic, which is basically this logic right here, and you also have an automatically generated OpenAPI file, which has like 100 benefits. Preferences, settings, search for water app. On, all right. I think that worked. Alrighty, thank you so much. Let me do a quick recap. What are we doing in this class? Understanding how to create OpenAPI files automatically for your HTTP backends. How do you do that in Node.js? You have to use a bunch of libraries you can use. The one that we're using is TSOA. This library depends heavily on decorators. So we understood what are decorators and what are classes. This is all you need to create an HTTP route using TSOA. Now this under the hood uses Express, which is something we'll see very soon. But it has these very nice decorators, and all you have to do is define a route like this and your application logic over here, and what inputs to expect, what method to expect, what does the route look like, /todo/todo ID. And this will eventually convert this into an Express application. This will also automatically generate your OpenAPI file so that you don't have to make these changes manually in that file. That's the high level of what we're trying to do in this class. Until now, what have we done? We have simply followed all the steps on their official documentation. So if you go to their library and try to do this yourself later on in the class, all you have to do is start from the top. The important things we did was initialize the repository, created a TSOA.json, and for every service that we have, for example, to-dos, in the future we might have a user service. We create a separate folder here, define the model here, which means what does the shape look like. For the user model, it will be like username, password, first name, last name, things like these. Service, which means just an abstraction to put things in the database and get things from the database. And a controller, this should be called controller, I think. Yeah, so this should, everyone who's been follow along, please replace to-dos service.ts with to-dos controller.ts, else it won't work. The file name does matter in this case because we've defined that here in the tsoa.conf file. All right, so please rename this to to-dos controller. All right. So, and finally here we have defined and exported a controller. This is the meat of the logic. This is where you write your, what is the input that you expect from the user when they're hitting your API. What is the application logic that you need to do when that specific endpoint is hit? All right. This is a quick recap. The code has been pushed on GitHub. How are we doing now? Is it still very confusing? Do we still need to marinate? Are we good? Are we understand? Can we proceed? No, pretty good. That was all that was needed. Just the code and a recap. Alrighty, cool. 84, 83. Cool. For the people who are still stuck, I'm happy to recap after this and teach this from the high level one more time. Again, what needs to be done is everything that's in this specific doc, and it's good enough for you to create your first OpenAPI spec file automatically generated through a backend code. All right, too many words. Let's try to compile this now. We have created our everything. We just need to now run it and see the backend running, see the OpenAPI file gets generated. All right. The next thing you need to do is create a top level app.ts file. So in in to-do backend, create a file called app.ts and copy over the code that's present here. What does it do? Gets express, does something here which ignore for now. We'll see what that is. Initializes express like we have until now, and then does a app.use URL included, which if you might remember, lets you decode URL parameters similar to app.use JSON, but for a different type of input format. I don't think we're using this at all. This specific input format we don't expect from our users, so you can also comment this. Feel free to keep it. Same for JSON. Right now we are getting a JSON input from our user, which is the input that comes for the to-do, the title and the description, and hence we need to use this. We may not need to use this. Feel free to have it. And then we call this register routes. This is something important. We have the app variable. We have not done app.get, app.post, anything, nothing we have done. However, they suggest import register routes from /build/routes. But there is no build folder. To-do application does not have a build folder. It does have a source folder. It does have node modules. It does not have a build folder. So what they say here is, which is the most important thing, which is creating this specific file, which will basically go through all your controllers. You define them here. This is all my controllers look something like this: source/folder name/something controller.ts. So it will go through all your folders, go to your controllers and convert them into express routes. So all you have to do is run. Firstly, create a folder called build and then run this command. You can also replace yarn with npm and it will still run. And it gives us an error. Entry file not found, source.app.ts. Let's see, source/todos is I created app.ts in the wrong place. Make sure you create it in the right place. You have to create it in the source folder and not in the folder outside. So source should have to-dos, source should have app.ts. That was the thing that the blunder that I did. Hopefully you did not do it. Let's try to rerun it. And you will see build folder now contains the route.ts file. All right. So what have we done? We told TSOA, the library, we didn't tell that we've told the TSOA that all our controllers are here. We ran the command yarn run TSOA routes, and that automatically generated a route.ts file. And in here, if you search app.get, you will see app.get/todo/todo IDs was created, which means TSOA is nothing. It under the hood creates express routes. But since it's defined in such a defined way, the way it makes you write code is so verbose put everything in decorators, so that whenever you have a decorator somewhere, the library kicks in, the TSO library will kick in. It will understand as a to-dos is the first route, whatever, and it can generate a lot of things from it. The things that it is generating is, one, the spec file that we will generate, the OpenAPI spec file. Two, this routes.ts file, which now that it understands app.get, the get route on to-do ID for the /todos route needs to do something. It converts this file into this very long file, which has a bunch of things, has very nice types. But most important thing to know is this: it eventually has an app.get, which does a bunch of argument validations. So all this logic it added, all the things that Zod used to do, it is doing for you because it understands your input and output types. And finally defines a to-do controller and then calls the to-do controller dot whatever. Somewhere here, maybe the function. Oh, sorry, this is the to-do controller. I'm looking for to-do service. Somehow internally in this file only, it's calling to-do service. Maybe it has renamed it or whatever. Let's see. Or maybe it's it is importing to-do controller somehow. Something is happening. You don't have to understand the generated file. Feel free to understand it as well. It's defining a few variables, for example, the models for your specific application, so on and so forth. The only thing I wanted to show was this function that it has, register routes, which takes an app as an input, and as you can see, calls app.get and then does all the magic inside. If you want to read through it, feel free to. Usually not the best idea to read auto-generated files because it's very ugly. But if you want to, feel free to, and understand under the hood how things are happening. Effectively, what is happening? A function called register routes is exported, and you're simply calling it where? in app.ts at the very end. What will this do? On your app instance, call app.gets, register all the app.gets, app.posts, so on and so forth. Save this file. As you can see, this error went away. What did I have to do? I just had to run this file to create the route.ts file. So I run this command. Finally, it says create a server.ts file as well. You can do all this that I'm doing, the things that I'm doing in server.ts in app.ts as well, but let's just follow them. And wrong folder. In your source folder, create a server.ts file right next to app.ts and copy the code from here, paste it here. All right. What does this do? Just gets app from here and calls app.listen on that specific port. Again, you can run all this logic in app.ts as well. This will work as well. This will work as well. Both are fine. All right. If you go down this route of using server.ts and importing app from here, then running yarn, then you have to run server.ts to start, else you have to run app.ts. Maybe just use server.ts just like I am right now. All right. So we have our top level file, server.ts. What does server.ts do? Imports app from here. What does app do? It does a bunch of app.uses, which is like making sure the right middlewares are called to parse the input data correctly. But importantly, it calls register routes. Where does this come from? This has been auto-generated from where? From the controllers that we wrote here. So all the controllers that we have written, right now we've just written one controller. That in there also we have a single method right now. As our application grows and we add like a create to do method here, a get all to do's method here, so on and so forth. All we have to do is run TSOA routes, which will update our build/routes.ts file, add the rest of the app.gets, app.posts here. And since that's what we're importing here, it will register all the routes. All right. Hopefully this is sort of clear. The last thing that you need to do is run the build command to actually build your server. So the command right here, which is tsc outdir build, which means put the final JavaScript files in the build folder and the experimental decorators flag that we had used until now. This to build, and then simply called node build/server source/server.js to run your backend application. Your backend application is working. And if you do a get, a post, or whatever, it'll just work. This is the way to bring up your backend application. But we have not yet done the main thing which we want to discuss, which was how do you create the spec file, which is what we're going to discuss next. What have we done until now? We have created an HTTP server similar to how we used to create it in Express, only the way we have written it is slightly different. It looks something like this. It's very different to how we had written app.gets and app.posts until now. And the reason is because we want someone else to convert this into Express code and also convert this into an OpenAPI file, which is why we had to write it in such a verbose fashion and use so many decorators all around. All right. The way to create Express code from this controller file is this yarn run TSOA routes. The way to create the OpenAPI spec file is yarn run TSOA spec. And this will create a swagger.json file here, which is our OpenAPI file. And if you look at the paths, it has /todo/todo ID, dynamic get path, which has one response, which is a 200, which has one parameter, which is the todo ID, which is the path parameter. And somewhere here, it might have the body as well, unless, oh, we did not have a body. This is a get what? Oh, this is a get. It does not have a JSON body. So all it expects as the parameters is one path parameter called todo ID. This is the very long, not very long in this case, but this is our auto-generated OpenAPI spec file. You might ask, Harkiyat, where is the base URL thing? You can configure all of that. I'm sure they provide you some way to, at the very global level, be like TSOA dot base URL equal to XYZ. You don't need to have base URL here. This file is enough for ChatGPT. You need base URL for ChatGPT, so you need to put the base URL somewhere here. But this is enough to understand the structure of your backend application. And again, you did not have to write this manually. Let's see some benefits of this file. This swagger.json, if you copy and if you go to Postman, you import raw text, paste it here. It will automatically, oh, sorry, I did not import it. It will automatically import it as a collection here. Why is it cool? It is cool because until now, when I created the course selling application, I had to manually create these collections. For example, the course selling app, I used to create these by hand and send it to you. Now I just pasted a file and that already has our right set of routes. So it understands this is the get to do's routes. It automatically has populated everything. If I put a base URL here as a variable, which is like, or just replace this with http://localhost 3000, replace to do ID with whatever and send the request. It just works if my backend is running, which is it isn't right now, but let's start it. And I get back the ID, title, description, all that jazz. So as our application becomes bigger and bigger, now that we have an automatically generated file, we can simply import it in Postman. Postman will automatically create a collection. We can do a bunch of other things. We can give it to an AI and ChatGPT can understand your backend routes. You can create clients, which is something we will get to very soon. But let's take a pause here and let's do a poll and understand how we're doing. Do you guys understand how this single file todos controller.ts is enough for you to one, generate all the express code for a backend server, two, generate the OpenAPI file or the swagger.json file. You can also create a YAML file if you need it. Both are fine, both are the same. All of this was done by this library under the hood, and these decorators is how it was able to do it and figure out how to generate both the express code and this. Alrighty, let's do a quick poll and understand how we're doing. Pretty good, it's not bad. Oh, slowly going towards bad. All right, 77%, that's great. So let me finish a few things and then happy to take doubts, chat, whatever. A few more things I wanted to talk about before we call it. Let's go to slides. Let me also push the code so you guys can pull it locally. I'm pushing everything, including the build for let me just not. Right, I've pushed the code as well. We have defined the controllers. We have inspected the auto-generated route file. We have the routes.ts file. We have inspected the OpenAPI file. We have imported it in Postman. Three more things I want to do was, let's ignore this step 7. Step 5 and step 6, let's try to do. The first one is called creating a Swagger page. Now this is a very famous thing. Some of you might have seen it, some of you might not have seen it. So this thing called the OpenAPI spec was created by a company that used to be called Swagger back in the day. And what they would do is they would give you something like Postman if you had this file. So they defined this file, they created the spec, and they would also give you something very similar to Postman to hit those routes. We haven't done that yet. Let's do that very quickly. You don't have to understand. It's a good idea to understand, maybe follow along. So yeah, let's just do it completely. Let's try to create an endpoint in our backend, which has like the Swagger page, which is a very famous thing. And let's try to use it and see how it's very useful. All right. All these steps are also in the same getting starting guide. If you go to the next page and then another page, live reloading, Swagger UI. There is a section. So in live reloading, there's a section called Swagger UI, supercharging our developer experience with Swagger UI. All right. Let's copy paste a few things that they're telling us to do. Then we'll try to understand what's happening under the hood. It asks us to add a new library and types for it. Let's do that. So all I've done is added one dependency and its types. Next it says, so there's a very famous, there's a library called Swagger UI Express. This is different from TSOA, completely different use case. This does not help you generate an OpenAPI file. Given an OpenAPI file, it lets you create the Swagger UI for it. So that's its use case. It's not used for creating the OpenAPI file. If you have an OpenAPI file, which could be manually, which could be auto-generated, it lets you do a bunch of things with it. All right. Copy this, go to app.ts. At the very top, import this thing, and then basically copy this whole thing and paste it here, which is on/docs make Swagger UI serve. What should it serve? This file, or basically the UI generated for this file. All right, copy, paste. Oh, maybe after the app. All right, and maybe also import these types like response and request from Express, and as X response, X request, and then everything is almost fine. Only thing is TypeScript does not let you import JSON files. So if you want to do that, you also have to, in your tsconfig.json, mark resolved JSON module as true. Let's go to tsconfig.json. Let's search for resolved JSON module. Let's uncomment it, and that by default the value is true. All right. Let's go back to app.ts, and the error goes away. All right. What have I done? I've simply installed Swagger UI Express. I've added these lines to my app.ts. That's all I've done. I've given it the path to my swagger.json file, which is the OpenAPI file. This works even if you have a different project which has its own OpenAPI file. Let's try to, now we have to do a few things. We have to build the code again. So we don't have to build the routes anymore. We just have to build the app.ts. So yarn run tsc -- outdir build -- experimental decorators. And once that's done, node build /source / server.js. Now, if you go to localhost :3000/docs, you should see like the what's called the Swagger page. You might have seen this in a few websites. A lot of backends that sort of expose their backend as an API, a lot of companies that do that have this Swagger page. Even ListMonk does. And here you see all their routes. We only have one route for now. As we add more routes, you can see it here. You can also interact with it. For example, it shows you what the input should be. It shows you what the outputs would be. There's a try it out button here. If you click on try it out, you can add a to-do ID. This is similar to me going in Postman and doing this localhost :3000/to-do/one call. This is sort of like Postman, only it understands the context of your application through the swagger.json file, which is your OpenAPI file. Click on execute and it will show you, okay, the response is okay. And you got back this from the backend, which is the same thing you see in Postman. So as you can see, people can very easily create clients now, because in one file you wrote everything. You wrote, bro, this is this, this is this, this is this. This is the route, this is what it does, this is the input, this is the output. And be it Postman, be it this guy right here, can simply, reading through that file, generate these UIs. That's what's called like automatic client generation. This is like one client that we were able to create without too much effort. All we needed was one file. Similarly, the clients that I was talking about initially are TypeScript clients, Golang clients. What that means is, if you want to interact with this backend via TypeScript, or let's say in a React application or Node.js application, what would you do? You would have a file. Let's say I'm just going to use this file. It would not be a file in this project. It would be a separate project, a React project over there. You would do like a fetch local host :3000/todos, or like whatever, axios.get this thing, right? The problem is, as our application grows, let's say I change the controller to take to-do ID as not a string, as a number, or I make it from to-do ID, I change it to just ID. I could make these changes, right? Then you have to make sure it's not, let's say I just change the route from to-dos to to-dos one. The end user needs to change this from to-dos to to-dos one. So things become more and more complicated for end clients in their Node.js applications, their React applications, if they have to do this. This is the reason you introduce clients. What are clients? Let's run a command that lets you create a Node.js client, and we'll understand what a client is. The command is, npx OpenAPI TypeScript codegen with slashes. Please copy this and paste this in chat. This is the command that lets you create the Node.js client for given this input file. So it does not understand your JavaScript code, your TypeScript code, your dist folder, your build folder. The only input to this command, the OpenAPI TypeScript code gen, as you can see, the name itself has code gen. The input is the OpenAPI file. The output is a folder, and we tell, okay, use fetch as the fetching library under the hood. You could also type Axios here, and it will use Axios as the underlying library to fetch. If I press enter here, you will see a new folder that's created here called the node-client. If you look at the index.ts, it exports something called the default service. What the Express application can now do is, rather than doing the fetch to whatever, or the React application, that React application, not this file, don't confuse this. This file is a separate project. I'm just using it right now just to show this quickly. In your React project, if you create a fresh React project somewhere, over there you can import default service from node client and simply call default service dot get to do, and then pass your to do ID as the input. If the backend ever changes, if the backend developers ever go and change to do ID to whatever, this function will begin to complain, and then you have to make your changes here. But you can always see what are the inputs. You can go to this function signature here and understand, acha, to do ID is the input. You will also get very nice types for the output. Okay, output it returns is to do. What is to do? Title, string, description, ID, done, so on and so forth. This does not come from our original project. This comes from the node client that we have created. And this node client has been created purely from the OpenAPI file. It does not understand your original server code. Only from the OpenAPI file, it was able to generate this to-do file. It was able to generate this default service, which has the get to-do function. As you add more routes, it will expose more functions. Your React application can simply call this rather than calling fetch. All right. That's what a client means. And you can create Golang clients. You can create Rust clients given an OpenAPI file. That's the benefit of creating a single file. You can create clients for multiple languages, and this is the way to do it for TypeScript. All right. Let's go back to slides. This is done. Swagger page. All right. We're going to call it here. One more thing I want to talk about was descriptions, which is basically nothing. If you go to the controller, again, the controller is where all the magic happens, and you add comments here. For example, this is the controller for creating to-dos. Basically, if you're creating a ChatGPT plugin, you should add a lot of context here, even for users. So this description will finally reach your OpenAPI file. If I regenerate routes here, or just the spec here, maybe just adding a comment here is enough for TSOA to know, acha, this is the description for this route. And if I search for this throughout my project, oh, you don't see it. Somewhere here you have to add this comment. There is a descriptions section here in the TSOA documentation, and inside you have to add. So let's do that. So this is where you should add a lot of context. What this does, human readable context, so the AI can understand, this to-do endpoint does XYZ. Let's generate the spec file. Again, I don't have to generate the routes. I just want to generate the spec file to show you guys, this still didn't work. Something obvious I'm missing here, but you can add comments to, maybe I have to create the routes. No, something else I'm missing here. $50 bounty. Quickly, जल्दी बता दो यार क्या मिस कर रहा हूँ मैं. I'm missing something obvious here. Try to go through this and try to figure out why descriptions are not coming in my swagger.json file. Ideally, they should. What am I missing? Oh, you need 2 comments. Indeed, you are right, sir. Yep, there you go. So if you start your comment with 2 stars, it will reach swagger.json. Since it has reached here, OpenAI projects can understand what your ChatGPT can understand what this specific thing is doing. All right. Let's look at some questions. Bounty किसको मिली है? Sheikh, yours was the first answer, so you win it. All right. Company is going to shift to TSOA to define CP routes. because it's easy to generate OpenAPI specs. Do you also have TSOA in your day job? We don't have TSOA in Backpack, but in other projects that I'm working on, which are not written in TypeScript, they are written in Rust. We do have OpenAPI. Companies may or may not move it. I'm not making that claim कि हाँ they will. But most projects, for example, ListMonk, do have OpenAPI files. A lot of them do not have them auto-generated. They have them written manually, which is when you need something like this. So ListMonk can be a repository. Now that does not use TSOA. That uses Golang. So you have to find a similar framework there and implement it. This is the high-level way to do it. In Node.js, the most efficient way to do it in Node.js with minimal effort required from the developer. Does TSOA make the entire source code much less intuitive? Doesn't it make it more less intuitive? The trade-off is getting automated OpenAPI spec over a simple Express syntax does not seem great here. That is debatable. People say the same thing for TypeScript. Okay, it's much harder to read TypeScript. It's much more verbose. Why do you have to define types? But there is a benefit there in the end, right? And the benefit here is automatic. There's another thing that you get here is automatic doc generation. Basically, creating this file is useful. I do agree, it feels more ugly, it feels more different. There are also easier ways to do this in Express. Over there, you have to write a lot of comments rather than using the decorators. You can go through those libraries as well. Not a lot of open source projects in Node.js use or OpenAPI spec generation. My guess is they may or may not. This is the best library to do it if you want to do it. The question is, do you want to do it or do not? That depends on the code base, the maintainer. But the trade-off is there. But again, I think it's the same trade-off between TypeScript and JavaScript, and TypeScript is better for 1,000 reasons. And I think the same logic applies here. You will find a lot of even Google Summer of Code projects where if there is a function written, above the function, there's a huge comment. Just like a bunch of things, examples, params, so on and so forth. And the reason for that also is automatic doc generation. So it's usually standard practice to do this, even though it does look more verbose and more ugly. The benefits that it has for automatically generating your docs is like 1,000 times more than the code looking ugly, is what I feel, and a bunch of open source projects feel. Could be wrong. So clients are basically abstract layer for API. They're basically a high level layer for your API. So your end users can simply call a function without looking at what fetch request, what endpoint, so on and so forth. What to do in case of nested routes and middlewares? So nested routes is straightforward. /to do /create /whatever. There is a middlewares section here, custom middlewares, which explains how you can create authentication middlewares, things like these. This is even more verbose and like will twist your head a little. You can do this. You can also create a middleware function and do authentication here. So maybe accept as a header an authorization header, and so this is the decorator to let OpenAPI know that a header called authorization is needed, and do your standard authorization checks here, like create a function which is similar to a middleware and do your auth tech checks, which say things like let user equal to check authentication, and then if user doesn't exist, then whatever else. But there is a more defined way to do it using custom middlewares in TSOA. Feel free to read it. I would go with this route unless you want your OpenAPI docs to also contain the authentication information automatically generated, which could be the case. So feel free to pick it. This gives like very nice. If I was going through this morning, if you want to create like authentication, there you go. Sorry, this might be the right section, not custom middlewares. So this lets you do like API key authentication, OAuth 2 authentication, and puts them correctly in OpenAPI. So this is the right way to do authentication. Might feel complicated, most probably is complicated. So may or may not go there in a project of my own. All right. Chat is open. Why at path gives red line? Good question. I was trying to figure that out as well. That can also be a bounty. So another $50 bounty. I'm sure it's most probably I need to update tsconfig to have something or whatever. But yes, even though tsc-b works, if I hover over it, it says declarations are not valid. Does anyone know this on the top of their head? Let's see. I have no idea. I saw this, but the build was, oh, sorry, 1 second. Muhammad, let me see. No, you weren't. Sorry, the comments on my side. First one was by Sheikh and Sheikh. Second one was by Prakhar, and yeah, I don't see it. Sorry, I didn't see it in chat. Restart versus code. Restart VS Code. Oh, is that it? That would be too funny if that's the case. Let's see. Exit. Visual Studio Code. Indeed, sorry, that's not it, dude. I still see it. Let's see. Chat. Anyways, I'm going to proceed. If someone knows the solution, feel free to post. We'll eventually let you know, and $50 bounty. So backend will provide swagger.json file to frontend to generate client. No. Swagger.json is present on your server on a backend. You use swagger.json to generate node client on the backend. Now that you have this node client, you can use it in Express, in another backend application. You can use it in a React application, wherever. You can publish this to NPM, and then other people can use this from NPM. So the generation of node client happens on the server. You can use the node client wherever you want, on the client, on the server, wherever. Recap the controller creation, please. Okay. So this is where the meat of the logic is. This is a file that you're writing not for Express, not for any HTTP server, for TSOA. Because TSOA is a very opinionated framework. This is how you should give me endpoints. Only then I will create your Express file. Only then I will create your documentation. So this is the high level code to create one route. You can create 10 routes. This is the kind of code you will have to write, which is add the route decorator, which says ki everything at /to-dos should reach this controller. Add a method, a specific route handler, ki any request that's coming to /asd/to-do/create/to-do ID should reach this function. And then your meat of your logic here. You need to define what are your path parameters, what are your body parameters, what are your headers that are required for this specific route. What is the route? What is the method of the route? What is the high level route? You have to write code like this so that TSOA can convert it into whatever. You may or may not do it. If you if you want to use TSOA and create the automatic spec file, automatic Node.js file, then you have to do this. If you want to create it by hand, if you want to use other frameworks, then you don't have to do this. But if you're using TSOA, this is the way to write your Express backend code, your backend code basically. Under the hood, this converts it to Express. It converts it to the swagger.json file. That code has been written by the maintainers/developers of TSOA. If you want to create a backend, this is how you have to write the logic for it. If you want to use TSOA for automatic OpenAPI file generation. All right, cool. So companies are going to, okay, I think I answered that. More questions? Pause. In Next.js, we have get static props, but in build Next.js automatically generates server side which is under the hood, even if we create those functions. So I am confused. I will answer this question tomorrow. We have a full recap of Next. Well, it's not of Next, it's only for React tomorrow, but I will try to cover it tomorrow. I think your question is the difference between get static props and get server side props, and how one generates the files that are served statically and the other generates files that are rendered on the server. Most probably not supposed to be covered tomorrow, but remind me and I'm happy to if we dive into Next.js tomorrow. Else we'll have to post it in Discord and I'll answer there. I did a Q&A. You can see it at 8:30. Oh, you did a Q&A. Oh, sorry. Please post it in the right place, sir. Let's see. Oh. Q&A. Mohammed Sheikh. Oh, okay. So you did it at 9 p.m. Let's see. Moment of truth. Sorry guys. I'll figure it out, and if that's the case, you'll get the bounty, and we'll figure it out. We'll split the bounty if the time goes the same. All right. What about Nest.js? What is Nest.js? I'm assuming you mean Next.js, and I'm not sure if this library works out of the box with Next. I mean, I'm almost sure it does not. So over there's another called Swagger what's it called? JS doc, something like that. that I used to use back in the day, Swagger JS doc, that lets you do the same thing by writing a bunch of comments above your route. This also may or may not work with Next.js. There might be the case that Next.js does not yet have a library that lets you do automatic OpenAPI generation. Maybe there is. Let's search Next.js OpenAPI automatic generator. Yeah, I see some library. Maybe this helps you out. This seems like it does the job. Next.js example OpenAPI generator. So I would look here. Experimental decorators needs to be enabled. Oh, this might just be it. Good one, Shanu sir. Let's see. So whoever asked why is this still appearing here, tsconfig search for experimental decorators and make that true. Save it and it goes away. Good one, sir. So yeah, when you're running tsc-b, we're running it with the flags explicitly, but a tsconfig still says experimental decorator is false, and you have to turn it true. If you turn it true, your type errors will go away everywhere. All right, you win $50, sir. Good one. I'm not able to get swagger.json. Are you able to run this command, yarn run TSOA spec? And if yes, do you see an error or do you see something else? Enable experimental support. Oh, Shivam might be the person who won it. My bad, dude. Shivam, oh no, Shanu was before that. So Shanu, then Shivam, then Shanu again, but I think Shanu was at the top. So Shanu still wins it. Use path params to do ID string. You mean use path params here? Is that exported? It is exported. No, it isn't exported. Sorry. What do you mean again, MD Faisal Alam? I think the setup is a bit hectic. I agree, dude. It's very hectic. Why would you do it? I don't know. I haven't done it. I haven't used it anywhere. This is the way to do it in Node.js. Doesn't mean every project will do it. You can also generate it by hand. You can also not generate it and be like, I will go with GraphQL or I will go with gRPC. This is just one of the ways to expose your backends to the world so that systems can understand it, users can understand it without looking at your code and looking out, like inspecting the network requests. But this isn't the only way. There is GraphQL and then there is gRPC that all can also solve the same problem. So you can really pick and choose whether or not you want to go down this route. Nest.js. What is Nest? Is that also a library that lets you do this? Oh, seems like there is a framework called Nest.js that may or may not also. Scalable server-side applications probably lets you do it. I had not heard of either of these until a week ago. So whichever you want to choose, but seems like there is one. This seems less verbose, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, it also lets you do the same thing. So there's another library called Nest.js that lets you do the same thing. If you want to look at it, it seems more cleaner than the one that we discussed today. Oh, fuck. A lot of people commented this. So the bounty was actually won by whom? Let's go to the top. Bilal Sheikh, Aditya Karna. All right. Yeah, so Aditya, you win the bounty. My bad, guys. My bad, Shanu. Bilal Sheikh. Sorry, it's very hard to know, but most probably Bilal Sheikh is the person who won it. And that's what I'm going to do. Give it to. Sorry, if your answer was below it, again, you answered it correctly. That's what matters. Oh no, sorry, it was Aditya. My bad. Aditya wins the experimental decorators bounty. Period. Full stop. Khatam. Okay. Write a simple code for to-do using TSO library so we can understand more clearly and can compare these two things. Maybe an offline video, just a Git repo. Okay. By the way, this is literally just a single route, like a simple to-do route. So like I would say this is that library. This is the bare minimum code that you need to sort of have in your code base to have a single route exported. So I would just use the current repository that I have posted as a boilerplate code, a simple project that exposes a single route. All right. Yeah, it was Aditya Karna. So cool. Any more questions, guys? Again, don't feel bad if you did not get the bounty, dude. You'll get another one, and again, you're meant for bigger things and more money. So you said you'll show us how you are learning at Meetup. How am I learning what? The AI thing? That will probably be an extra class. Yeah, I think that's what you mean. Can we have an offline video on cron jobs and webhook? I saw this request before. Maybe it was by you only. Sure. I can do like a 30-minute video. Maybe not right now, but whenever I get the time. Let's cover the syllabus first and then extra topics we can do whenever. Yeah. Right. Can you show build things? How can you show build thing from yarn run thing? How can you create the build folder? I'm assuming is your question. And yeah, it is yarn run TSOA routes. First create the build folder by using this command, and then run yarn run TSOA spec to generate the spec and routes to generate the routes. Alrighty. Cool. I think that's all the questions. So for the bounty, let's be a little civil here. It's fine if you did not get it. Maybe you were first, maybe you were last, does not matter. And again, the names that I said will eventually win it. And I do apologize if you gave it first. Please don't make this a pain for me, and then we'll just have to stop the bounties. So if not this one, you'll get it in the next video. And I do apologize for all the this being extremely hectic. All right. Then use TS node when you don't want to do two steps of converting to a JavaScript file and then calling the JavaScript file. You can use TS node. I never use it, but I've seen people use it, so it's fine. All right. Cool, guys. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll call it here, and I'll see you guys tomorrow, where we're just doing a recap of React and Next.js. All right. Cool.